As you said, my name is Valerie Palmer. I am a US-based US college and university application expert. I have been working with admissions in some capacity for over 20 years. While I do primarily specialize in US applications, and tonight our focus is going to be mostly about US based applications. I also have experience with UK and Canadian applications as well. But like I said, because there are so many differences, tonight is going to be mostly focused on those US based colleges and universities and that application process. So you might be wondering, what are the components of a standard application? What do I need to submit as an applicant to this university or to this college? So the first thing that you obviously need to complete is the application form. So I say it's the first thing, and I'll explain why that's not exactly true in just a minute. But for all intents and purposes, we'll start with that as being number one. So the first thing that you need to think about is the application form. We just talked about the different ways and places that you can complete that and where you would find that information. The next thing that they need is your academic record, and they see that through your transcripts. So this typically is going to require you to have your transcripts sent it is going to require you to have your transcripts sent. Sometimes these documents need to be translated into English if they aren't already. So that is something to be aware of. And also something else to be aware of is that specifically for international students, some schools will require a credential evaluation. So what that means is there are third-party services like WES and ECE that will convert your grades to the US grading system and certify that you have completed all of the necessary requirements for that particular college. So if that is something that you need to do, that is something that does take a little bit more time because there is some processing time for that. So like I said, there are a couple of organizations that do that. There's actually quite a few organizations that do that. If you need recommendations for that, the admissions office for the university you're applying to can provide that to you, and they might even have that information on their website. Like I said, their website is going to be, where you find the best and most accurate information that you need. That it can take anywhere from 2 weeks to 8 weeks, depending on when you submit that for evaluation. So that is why I go back to recommending that you get your application in sooner rather than later. Even if you're not applying early, whether that's early action or early decision, even if you're doing regular or rolling admissions, that gives you the time to find out what exactly the admissions office needs in terms of your academic record and academic transcript. And then it builds in that time for you to send it to the accrediting or credential evaluating service if you need to. The next thing that a lot of schools look at are going to be test scores. Now, since COVID, a lot of schools have decided that they are either test optional or test free, but not every school. And some schools are going back to requiring tests. So this information is going to be something that you need to know, and it's something that you can find on each university's admissions webpage. So the standardized tests that they might require are SAT or ACT scores, and potentially an English proficiency exam. So this gets a little tricky because depending on where you received your education, if that was all in English, most schools will waive that English proficiency exam. However, I have run into some schools who might not be as international student friendly, who don't have a policy in place, and their policy is simply that every student must submit an English proficiency exam. So just be aware that this might be something that you get asked for. Hopefully it's not, but it might be. If you do have to do an English proficiency exam, there are a couple of options. There's the TOEFL, there's the IELTS, and there's Duolingo. Each of those has a minimum score associated with it. And again, if you need to do this, the admissions office will let you know. A lot of times, like I said, this will be waived, but I don't want to tell you that it's not going to be required, and then you run into a situation where it is. So I just like to put that information out there. The next thing that's going to be required are personal statements and essays. So every application that you complete is going to have a personal statement component. Typically in the US, this is up to 650 words, and they give you a couple of prompts that you can write about. You pick one of those prompts and you write about it. Um, and so you want to make sure, obviously, that when you're thinking about what to write, you are thinking about what makes you as a student and as a person unique. What do you bring to the college? And I always recommend, if you can tell them a story through your essay, to tell them a story. Storytelling is always better than just telling. And I have a lot of examples of this, and I can certainly answer questions on that later, but I do just want to touch on that. Um, I have been asked on occasion by some international students, well, is it really required that I write a personal statement? And the answer typically is going to be yes. And the reason is because we are filling out applications online, you're unable to submit it without putting something into that personal statement area, into that personal statement box, text box that they have. So typically, yes, you are going to be required to write something. Um, and then the last thing that you might need for a standard, for, as a standard component for an application, is letters of recommendation. So these would typically come from teachers that you've had, a school administrator that you've had. That's typically who these come from. Coaches might also write you a letter of recommendation, or if you have a mentor within the community, they could also write you a letter of recommendation. And really, just so you have a heads up, you want to make sure that they're focusing on, your readiness for the academic environment, whether that's here or in your home country, right? You want to make sure that they're letting the admissions committee know that you're academically ready for, a university and academic environment. A little bit different. So in US-based college admissions, we have four key deadlines that you need to remember, or four types of admissions that you need to remember. We have early decision, early action, regular decision, and rolling admissions. So early decision, these are going to be the first deadlines that come up, right? These are going to be typically between November 1st and November 15th. So I want you to think about that. That's going to be, as you're wrapping up your senior year is when the application and all of the supplemental materials are going to be due. You're going to have to get all of that information into the college sometime between November 1st and November 15th. If you apply early decision, and I caution students to be very careful and think about if this is something they want to do, early decision admissions are binding. So that means that you've committed to that university if they accept you. So that sounds great in theory, but it is a long process in the US system. And so I always tell students, I always ask students, are you sure that you want to commit to university? Are you sure you want to commit to university, before you've seen and gotten admissions decisions from anywhere else? And so typically the answer is no, because the other thing that you don't necessarily know about yet is scholarships, right? They're not necessarily going to give you any academic scholarships that you might qualify for that early. You might have an idea about your athletic scholarships, but you won't typically have any idea about your any academic scholarships that you might be eligible for. Early action means that you get a decision early, but it is not binding. You are not obligated to attend that school if you're accepted. These deadlines are typically in November and December. They can be anywhere from November 1st to December 15th. And like I said, it does not require you to commit to the school. It just gets you your information sooner. The next category we have is regular decision. And I'll be honest, most students apply in the regular decision applicant pool. Unless you know that you really want to, to apply somewhere and have that decision early, most students are applying regular decision, which is going to be from January 1st typically to about February 1st. Some might have decision or might have deadlines a tiny bit earlier than that or a tiny bit later than that. And I'll tell you where you can go to find those specific deadlines soon. But just know that that's sort of the general window. And then rolling admissions. Typically, rolling admissions, they don't close their application deadlines until much later. So even sometimes as late as, April and May, which sounds great in theory, but when you're an international student, you definitely don't want to put off your application and your application process that late because there are pieces of the student visa process that just take long. They take a long time. And so to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you're kind of scrambling last minute to make sure that the visa and all of that stuff is in order, I definitely suggest not waiting until the last minute to apply. I would absolutely suggest getting all of your application materials in, no later than the middle of January is what I suggest for all international students, just to be on the safe side. So I talk about tools here at the bottom. So there are a couple of things, a couple of tools that you need to be aware of as you're thinking about the US college application process. So we have, I have on here Common App, Coalition, and individual university portals. So these are all ways that you can apply to different schools. And I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit too, so that you have an understanding of what each of these are. In the US, we have a system called the Common App. We also have a system called the Coalition App, app short for application. And so what those are essentially where schools have decided, okay, I will accept this one common form or coalition form. And that way it allows students to fill out one application and send it to multiple schools instead of having to fill out each individual school separately. I've listed Common App and Coalition App. Those are the two biggest ones. Those are the two most popular ones. But there are a couple others that are smaller and more limited, and that you will find out about on the university's admissions website if they need you to go through that portal specifically. So what is the best way to find out how you need to apply, where you need to apply, when you need to apply by, what the school's deadlines are? The best place is going to be that university's website. That is always going to be the best place. Their admissions page on that university's website is going to hold all of this information. They're going to tell you if they accept applications early decision or not, if they accept applications early action or not. And if they do, what are those deadlines? They're going to tell you what the regular decision deadlines are. And if they have rolling admissions, they're going to tell you if there's a deadline associated with that. So this is how you're going to get that information, by going straight to that university's website. And then, like I said, that's also where they're going to tell you what applications they accept. Virtually all colleges have their own application, but if you're filling out an individual application for every school that you're applying to, that could be 5 or 6 schools. That's a lot of time spent filling out the same information over and over again, which is why students really prefer something like the Common App, so that they can fill the information out one time and say, okay, yep, I'm going to send it to this college and this university and this university and this university. And it's one application to fill out. So it's much less, it requires much less of your time. So that's definitely something to look at. The next thing that I suggest doing is using a calendar or a checklist, or even an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet, to keep track of the colleges that you want to apply to, what their deadlines are, where you apply to them, and where you are in the process. And so that is something that I tell all of my students and all of my clients, it is the best way to keep track is either using a calendar system, a checklist system, or a spreadsheet system. But make sure that you have one that is solely dedicated to this process, which is why some people tend not to use calendars, but more checklists and spreadsheets. Make sure you use those, because those are going to be really, really helpful in keeping track of everything. All right. So next I want to jump into the difference between public institutions, public universities and colleges, and private universities and colleges. So there is some difference. The two big differences that you'll see are funding, and then resources and athletic support. And obviously, this is an important piece for you guys. Um, so public institutions, in terms of funding, they are typically most of their funding comes from the state. Um, and not from tuition dollars. They also typically offer a lower in-state tuition rate, and a higher out-of-state and international tuition rate. Public institutions also tend to have larger enrollments. They tend to be bigger schools. Um, so that's important to know, when you're thinking of your college experience, how big of a school do you want to go to? You've got a school, and I'm going to go to back to Penn State because that is where, I went to school. There are 48,000 students on Penn State's campus when I was there, and that was quite a while ago. And so, do you want to go to a school that big? Do you want to go to a school a little bit smaller? These are important considerations to ask yourself as you're going through this process, figuring out where would be a good fit for you. Private institutions aren't typically funded through the state. They typically get no state funding or federal government funding whatsoever. So that means that all of their funding comes in from tuition and endowments that they have. And so these also tend to have a higher tuition costs, which I call the sticker price. So that's, when you look on their website, it says, the cost of the college is this much per year, which can be a little bit unnerving, especially before you consider sports scholarships and potentially other scholarships that you might get. The nice thing about private institutions is that they do tend to offer more generous financial aid packages and more generous scholarships. They have access to some of that funding to provide that for students who are both domestic and international. The resources and athletic support, that's another big area where we see a difference. So public schools typically have more extensive athletic programs because they have higher budgets, they have bigger budgets. And private schools tend to give you more personalized attention, and give you resources that are specifically tailored to you that can help you as a student athlete. So that again is another good consideration that you want to be thinking about as you're looking at different colleges. The next thing that I tell all of my students you really want to consider when you're looking at a college is their setting. So geographical considerations. Here, I'm mainly going to talk about, urban, suburban, and rural, but also other geographic considerations that might come up for you are, are they located on the East Coast, in the center of the country, or the West Coast? What is going to be easier for you to get to as you're making your trips to the university to go there as a freshman? So that is another consideration that you might want to look at. So I really think it's important to consider whether or not you want to attend a school that's urban or in a city, suburban, or rural. There are pros and cons to each of this. So urban schools are going to be located in a city and they're going to have access to all of the amenities in a city. So this is going to give you access to internships, additional cultural diversity events, additional training facilities, and a lot of networking opportunities. However, living in a city does tend to cost more than living in a suburb or in a rural area. So housing might be more expensive, especially if you're living off campus. There are the potential for some other distractions because you've got other things that are happening in the city since cities are so robust and vibrant. And so those are the big considerations, big pros and cons that I like to talk about for that area. The other thing that you're going to notice with urban areas is they tend to have airports closer. And so that might be a big consideration for you, depending on, flights and flight availability and things of that nature. Suburban colleges are located outside of cities or in more, not residential, but more suburban areas where they could be adjacent to a city or they could also kind of be a little bit further out from the city. They may or may not have access to good airports, international airports, but they will likely have access to regional airports. So that is definitely both a pro and a con of suburban schools. These tend to offer a balance of accessibility and a bit more quieter environment. There's less external distractions from, from the outside areas. And they often bring in a strong sense of community. So you'll feel a much stronger sense of community in schools that are in suburban locations than in urban locations. Um, and, again, I mentioned, considering the transportation options for urban or sorry, for suburban and rural locations. The next thing or the next one on my list is rural. So these are not going to be located near any major city or even necessarily near a major town. The college is probably pretty self-sufficient. But that also does mean that there's a lower cost of living. So if you are going to be living off campus at any point in time, which typically wouldn't happen until, much later in your college career, there wouldn't be as high costs around, off-campus apartments and things like that. They also do, just like their suburban counterparts, they do have a much more close-knit community, and they're, very focused on the academic environment. The cons to that, there are typically very few public transportation options, and there may not be an airport within several hours drive. So that is something to consider as you're thinking about where you might want to go is the potential challenge of traveling there. Um, and I think I mentioned, but they often have less access to off-campus internships. So if internships are important for you for your future career, then that is something to consider. All right, so understanding the academic calendar in the US. So here in the US, our academic calendar typically runs from mid to late August through May or June. And we have a long summer break for a couple months. Typically, there's a shorter break during our winter season, which is, December into January. But this is in deep contrast to what you all are used to in South Africa. So as I understand it, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, your academic year starts in January and pretty much goes through November or December timeframe. So why does this matter? Why is this important to you at all? That's what I want to help you understand right now. So this difference in academic calendars might play a role or might impact test scheduling for the SATs or ACTs, or if you have to take an English proficiency exam, that it might impact some of that for you. And so that is why planning ahead is very important. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Um, the other thing is our applications, when we do our applications, looks a little bit different than when you do them. And I'm going to go into the details about this. So don't panic too much. I'm going to get the details to you just momentarily, but you might end up with a break between when you finish high school and when you actually start attending the university. Because like I said, our universities start typically in August. So you would be coming either in the beginning of the summer or more towards the end of the summer, depending on your sport, depending on the college. There's a couple different factors there. The next thing I want to talk about is understanding US universities, right? So every country has its own culture, every state within the United States has its own culture, and every university has its own culture. Um, Manya and I have both been to Penn State and we share that culture, but I've also attended universities elsewhere and they are vastly different. So it's really important to understand the feel of the place that you're going to. So I really suggest that you look at the university's websites, right? That's going to be first and foremost your best source of information for anything pertaining to that university is directly from their website. You're going to want to look at things like what does their campus life look like? What organizations do they have? What programs are they running? Are they mostly a commuter college where students are coming and then they go home on the weekends, or are people there pretty much all the time? Most Division I schools, good news is that most of the students do stay on the weekends because they are interested in attending those sports games. So that does help. But, taking that into consideration and making sure that you are going to university, you're applying to universities that fit with, your values, your ideals, the kind of experience that you're hoping to have is really important. You are going to be there for at least 4 years. So we want to make sure that we get that right the first time. Other things that you can do is you can look for testimonials. I've provided a couple of samples here of where you can find those. US News and World Report, Simply or College Simply, and Niche all provide student testimonials that'll give you a better understanding of what that particular university is like from a social standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and what you can expect. And you can also look at social media channels and different discussion boards. Some people like Reddit, some people like College Confidential. Obviously, anytime you're pulling in social media channels, you do have to be a little bit careful, because not everything that you read on there is going to be true, but it will give you kind of an overview of what to expect. So when you are thinking about, where I'm going and you're reading these reviews and what people say, and you're looking at the website and you're looking through their organizations and you're looking at their dorm life and looking at all their different programming and programming that they bring to the college, or to the university itself, as well as different programming that they have for you at the college. There's different things that you want to look at. So first thing is the variety of student organizations and clubs. Is there diversity in that? Do they offer things that you're going to be interested in doing outside of your time in the classroom and outside of your time at sports? And then also look and see if there's any campus traditions that really resonate with you. For example, Carnegie Mellon, which is a university in Pittsburgh, they're a private school, small private school in Pittsburgh. They have something called the Wall, and different student organizations or even individuals can paint the wall, or the fence, I'm sorry, to bring awareness to about a cause, to advertise something. And so this has become really a big campus tradition for them. And there are a lot of traditions around it. It's a lot of fun. And that's just one example, but make sure that you're looking for traditions, right? You're looking at extracurriculars so that you can get that overall feel. The other thing that you can do in order to get the feel for a college campus is to do a virtual tour. So you would find these directly on the college or university's website. And they would have that through their admissions office. And that will give you a good sense of where things are on campus, what the student body looks like, what kids on campus are doing in their free time, how they're spending their free time. You can also look at things like YouTube, campus tours. Those are going to have some options for you as well. But I find that the best resource of all for virtual campus tours is the university website itself. All right, so for scholarship and financial planning, there are different types of scholarships that you might be eligible for. First and foremost are the athletic scholarships. When it comes to athletic scholarships, there are both full scholarships and partial scholarships. So full scholarships cover typically the full tuition amount of that school and any mandatory fees that are associated with that. Typically, full scholarships also cover room and board, so your housing where you're living and your meals. They will also sometimes cover books and supplies, and they might cover other additional costs like health insurance, athletic fees, if there are any athletic fees, or specific program fees that are associated with your major. So full tuition scholarships are obviously the ones that we're all aiming for, right? We want to make sure that everything is covered. However, some students do get partial scholarships, and partial athletic scholarships are designed to help offset the cost of attending a specific college or university, but they don't cover all expenses. So partial scholarships might be, they might cover a specific portion of your tuition. They might cover 25% of tuition and fees, 50% of tuition and fees, or 75% of tuition and fees. Some partial scholarships do include a component for room and board, but primarily these awards are typically just used for tuition and fees. If they do cover a part of room and board, again, it's only going to be a percentage of that room and board. Usually they're not going to cover other academic expenses. So that is something to just remember. If you get a partial scholarship, there are going to be other expenses to just be aware of. I say that knowing that there might be other scholarships available to you. Some schools, like I mentioned earlier, private schools, they offer typically academic scholarships for their students. So you might get a partial athletic scholarship and then a partial academic scholarship. And when you combine those two, obviously that's going to give you more coverage of the total cost. So that's certainly something to look into. There are other scholarships that are available. Some schools have specific international scholarships, which is great because it definitely helps you offset some of those costs. Or you might be able to go through, a local organization, local government, things like that to help get some other scholarships, depending on where you live and how that is set up. So other things to think about when it comes to scholarships and, specifically sports scholarships. So scholarships are given and they are applied directly to your student account so that it will either reduce or completely eliminate the bill that you need to pay each semester. They are not typically given out as cash for discretionary spending or as money for discretionary spending. And a lot of times in order to retain a scholarship, to keep your scholarship to retain your scholarship year after year, you do have to meet certain criteria, academic standards, and potentially athletic performance levels to ensure that you can keep receiving that scholarship. They will tell you what those requirements are when they give you the scholarship. So that's not something that you need to be thinking about yet, but it is something that you will need to be aware of if you do get a sports scholarship or even an academic scholarship. Next thing I want to talk about is just some tips, right? Some things that you want to make sure that you do or don't do. And these are pretty self-explanatory. I've talked a lot about, preparing and submitting your application early. And why that's important. So obviously, naturally, it's going to be important to start early. It also really helps, like I said, if you keep everything in for your application materials, universities that you're going to apply to, their deadlines, their requirements, all of that in one central place. And that is going to help you create a personalized timeline for each institution. And so what that means is like, okay, if I need to get my application in by January 1st, I don't want to wait until January 1st to do it, right? I probably want to make sure I'm doing it at least a couple days ahead of time. So that way, in case there's a glitch in the system, which I have seen happen, my application still gets through on time. And then, did I send my transcripts where they needed to go? Did they get the letters of recommendation that they needed to get? So keeping a personalized timeline for when you want to have every component in is really helpful to stay organized during this process. When you're doing your essays, I talked briefly about the main essay. Some schools also do have supplemental essays. These may or may not be required for you as a student athlete. This is going to vary by institution. And this is also why it's important to get your application in early because they can then let you know, yes, this is required or no, it's not required, the supplemental essays. So if there are supplemental essays, it is really important to make sure that you're writing to that specific college because they're going to be asking you things like, why do you want to go to school here? And so you really need to have a good answer to that. Make sure that you're looking over all of your documents, right? The whole application, that everything is accurate and correct. It's helpful to have parents coaches, counselors, other people, look over these documents as well to make sure that everything is correct, everything is in order, and it's ready to go. Um, and then, obviously we want to make sure that we're not missing deadlines. Some schools have a little bit of flexibility in their deadlines, while other schools do not. And that is not something that they advertise on their website because they don't want you to miss their deadlines. So make sure that you don't miss deadlines because with some schools, they will still let you turn things in. Other schools won't. They won't make any exceptions. Um, I talked about making sure that your essays, if you have supplemental essays, they're really specific to that college if you're required to do them. And then make sure that you're turning in all of the required supplemental materials. And here's why. If you submit your application, they keep that on file until they get all of your supplemental materials. They don't consider your application complete until they have everything that they require. And that's when they'll start reviewing it. So make sure that like you're keeping a good timeline and so that you don't miss any of the documents.